So you guys getting worn out yet? Back in school? Well, I'm glad you're here because dyslexia actually turns out to be a really important thing these days. And I know some of you guys haven't been here for the first three that we did. So there's a couple of things that I want you to know. Firstly, dyslexia is a specific learning disability that's neurological in origin, which means that it's not a function of kids being lazy or not intelligent or not wanting to learn how to read or any of that. There's evidence that it's a genetic situation, and specifically there's evidence that prenatally the particular neural networks aren't being formed because the blueprint from the genetics aren't there to do so. And these areas affect the posterior part of the brain, which the temporal parietal and parietal occipital lobes and areas aren't processing letters, sound, and word form very well. And we also showed in previous sessions that individuals who have dyslexia, just to show as evidence that they're trying really super hard to learn how to read, they're using part of the brain that gets activated and lit up really big time, more so than is necessary, because of the other parts of the brain aren't working so well. And so it really has nothing to do with children not really wanting to learn how to read, because that's why they go to kindergarten. You ask a kid in kindergarten, what do you want to do when you go to school? Learn how to read. That's what I want to do. And then they find out that there's issues as a function of them learning how to read that they can't control, and that therein is the problem. The second major problem that occurs is that, unfortunately, in colleges of education, they do not teach the science of reading. They don't teach how to anything about dyslexia per se in most places. Don't talk about evaluation or intervention techniques to help kids with dyslexia, which is really very sad, because if we have 15 to 20% of our kids who have dyslexia, and we have another up to about total 33% of our kids who are not reading where they need to be reading, that's a major problem. And it's a major problem we can correct if we get professors in the College of Education to actually learn about science and then teach the science of reading, which lately I've been fairly critical of that. And we have something accepted for publication. It's very critical in the discussion section about colleges of education, and then one that's in revision, hopefully be accepted, that actually goes a lot further than that and tells them what they need to do to change the system. But if you guys want to know about dyslexia, you should have been taught that in school. There's no reason for that not to have occurred. Particularly if you were in colleges of education being taught within the last 30 years. These are things that aren't new. We're knowing more and more stuff as a function of what's going on with dyslexia. These aren't things that are completely new to us. We knew them in the 1970s, we knew them in the 1980s. It's just unfortunately it hasn't been transferred to pre-service teachers so they could use them when they become in-service teachers. That's a whole different story. What we're interested in today, and this is who I am, you can read about that later. Not that important, but we really want to talk about intervention strategies. And I was going to talk about our intervention strategies first and then talk about prevention. Then I thought really prevention comes before intervention, so might as well do it at least accurately. We talked about already that learning to read the English writing system is an extremely difficult and effortful process, more so than other alphabetically based systems. And the reason why is it's what we call an opaque writing system, in which you do not get to the phonology very easily. And if you think, I don't know what you're talking about, well, there are roughly 43 or 44 phonemes in the English language. How many letters represent those in the alphabet? 26. Oops, we got a problem. If you want to look at how many vowel letters do we have in the alphabet? 5, 6 if you count Y, correct? There's 19 different vowel sounds. There's alternative spellings. Like if you look at the E sound, the long E sound, you can spell it E by itself like B, E like in C, E consonant E, I-E, E-I, E-A, Y, E-Y, I like in piano. Crazy, right? So it's almost as if 250 years ago people thought, what would be the best way to keep most people from learning how to read in English? This would be a good one. And then once you get past that, we have R-controlled vowels. We have digraphs that are made up of 2 letters, but together actually don't represent either the sounds individually. Like sh, sh, sh. That's a phoneme by itself. It's represented by s. So if you're looking at a kid, you tell them S is s and H is h. So they're going s. But it's not it, right? It's sh. I mean, there's lots of them. And then once you get past that, then we have to look at the alternative spellings. Then we look at the homophonic words like through and to and to and hey and hey, fur and fur and fur. It's like, it's tough. And so in other writing systems, and this is just a little bit of background why this is an issue. Other writing systems, like Finnish is one of the most transparent writing systems where you get from orthography to phonology very quickly. German, Spanish, Italian, some of those transparent writing systems, their children don't get stuck with reading like ours do. Because our writing system is so difficult that if you have dyslexia, it basically stops you from learning how to read or learning how to read very well. Where if you're in a transparent writing system, you can have the same neurological issues that our kids who have dyslexia in our country or our culture have. But what they become are very slow readers because the decoding and synthesis process is so much easier for their language. So, learning to read English is extremely difficult and effortful. Kids who learn in the transparent writing systems start to learn to read later than our kids, and they're done earlier. It's just easier to decode. But our kids get basically stuck. Critics have argued that reading is not taught correctly. And I would say that I would agree with that notion to some extent, depending on how reading is being taught, particularly children with dyslexia. Because one of the things that's typically said is that children who have dyslexia are going to suffer in terms of learning how to read, even with appropriate classroom instruction. But I would argue that that's not true. If they had appropriate classroom instruction based on the science of reading, they'd have a more likely chance of learning how to read competently. Not necessarily a fast reader, but competently. And so, Reed Lyon, Lyon of the architect of No Child Left Behind fame, you know him, right? Actually, Reed Lyon was the director of Child Health and Human Development, giving out millions of dollars per year, National Institute of Health, and they're finding out that all these studies were saying we could help kids become competent readers who were very poor readers, and he thought, why aren't we then? Well, the answer is because researchers don't talk to practitioners, teachers. And so he thought, let's create a law, we'll call it No Child Left Behind, where literally no child will be left behind. We're going to make sure that school systems are motivated to seek out researchers to solve the problem. Great idea. The gist of that law, the reason why it came into fruition, great idea. George Bush did a wonderful job getting that in place. Unfortunately, the rest of it got screwed up. Right. So the high-stakes testing, that's somewhat of a problem. Holding schools accountable is somewhat of a problem because as a teacher, you can have a whole class of kids come in who no one's ever done anything with them, and you're getting graded on what they don't know. Because even when we do assessment there, we should be finding out what they gain through the course. Like if you get kids who come in low, they get tested at the end, the gain score is how you're rated. How much you've taught them during the year. We don't do that. So there's a lot of goofy things that really don't make any sense. It's the luck of the draw who you're going to get essentially in that year. And Flash and McGinnis have also been pretty demonstrative about their unhappiness about how kids with dyslexia are being taught. But the other thing I'll tell you about Reed Lyon is, I was at the International Dyslexia Association conference, I would guess probably 10 years ago, and he did a presentation and people were asking questions and they said, what other law would you like to have enacted since you had success with the No Child Left Behind? Because he basically wrote that law. And he didn't even blink an eye, didn't hesitate, didn't think about it. He said, I'd like to burn down every college of education in the United States. And I was like, wow. But that's his frustration, because we have the scientific knowledge to give to pre-service teachers so they could learn it and practice it, so by the time they got into schools, they'd actually be able to use it to help kids learn how to read. But we're not there yet. Not there at all. So the question becomes, how should reading be taught? And that's what we're going to talk about first. How should it be taught? Well, teach reading by focusing and strengthening the phonological processing skills, because we know that's a particular issue with kids who have dyslexia. Introduce letter sounds for a set series of letters. In other words, make a temporary, transparent writing system, one in which they understand the mechanics of it. Introduce letter names after letter sounds have been mastered. Because think about it, we have this crazy system that's really hard to understand, and we're going to talk about the letters that represent sounds and the name of the letters at the same time, because that's crazy. Now most parents will at first balk at that. They're like, wow, I don't know if that's a good idea. All right, well let's just assume your kid knows all the letter names and knows no letter sounds whatsoever. They get to the word dog, and this is how they read it. D-O-G, D-O-G, D-O-G. That's not the word, is it? The parents are like, oh, I see what you mean. Now if we teach them that the D represents D, and the O can represent a lot of different things, but in this case, A. And then the G is G, D-O-G, D-O-G. And they're getting it, like dog. But if all you know is the letter names, it's not going to really help you out. So at first, they don't talk anything about the letter names whatsoever. We teach letter writing, which a lot of times in schools we're not really focusing on writing, but what we're doing in the process when they're writing is they're saying the sound that the letter represents, which is essentially a multi-sensory event. But the reason why we do it is when you do those types of things, they're imprinting that memory a little more strongly neurologically than just looking at it. Just like when you're in college, if you look at PowerPoint and you just stare at it like, hey, I get it, and then you leave, you forget it, right? But if you take notes and you're actively involved in the learning process, because humans learn the same way. I mean, we can do all kinds of fancy stuff, but to get stuff from short-term memory into long-term memory takes practice, right? It takes rehearsal. Cognitive scientists call that rehearsal. If you don't do those things, it's not going to be a long-term storage. I think a lot of people don't really clearly understand that at times. And people say things like, I multitask all the time. Humans do not multitask. We're not multitaskers. We do not do all these things at the same time. What we find in cognitive science is when people think they're doing multitasking, what they're doing is they're doing one thing and shifting to another thing rapidly, going back and forth, which means we're not doing any of them very well. That's why you should not text and drive. Or text and drive and put on makeup and eat and whatever. I see people doing stuff in Walmart parking lot. I'm like, gosh, this is the dangerous place on the planet. They're driving 60 miles an hour, eating and reading and texting. It's crazy. So we don't do multitasking stuff very well. So the reason why they're doing the writing and saying it out loud is it does imprint stronger in terms of memory what we want them to remember. And of course, when you leave lecture, if you've already written it, you understand it better, and when you go home, you have notes that make sense to you. Use multisensory techniques. Teach decoding and synthesizing skills. Decoding is looking at the word, looking at the individual letter, decoding it to its sound, and then synthesizing is blending the sounds together once you've decoded them. And we teach that after 3-letter correspondences have been, learned CVC syllables or VCC, vowel consonant consonant like ant, A-N-T, CVC like dog, D-O-G, etc. So then we teach synthesizing. We teach that in conjunction with decoding because we want them to do that together. First comes decoding, then comes synthesizing. We want to teach spelling. And we want to teach spelling very, very early on. We don't wait till they've read for a long time and go, oh, by the way, there's this thing called spelling that's kind of important. If you want individuals to understand the code very well, you need to link them together. So decoding, you understand the code and how you decode the letters into the sounds. When you spell, you're encoding the sounds into letters. And if you want the kids to understand the reciprocal nature of the code, then you got to teach those things pretty early on, so they think they're both important, rather than thinking one is easy and one's more difficult. Because in terms of cognitive science, reading process, to some extent, is a recognition memory task, which is a simpler task than spelling, which is a recall task. It's just like when you took multiple choice test, that's a recognition task because you recognize the answer. Where an essay test is a recall, you have to recall that information yourself. So that's much more challenging, right? So spelling is more challenging. Plus, when we talk about alternative spellings, there's all kinds of goofy stuff that goes on. We also don't want to talk about the rules of spelling or the rules of reading because there are no rules. Remember what a rule is. In science, a rule is always true. How do you spell the E sound? There's no rules there. I before E and E after. I can show you examples in each of those cases when it's not the case. So don't tell kids that there's rules. Tell them, and the kids will understand this if you present this properly to them. Tell them it's probability statements. We're talking about them being little detectives and figuring out clues, probability that this is the way you say it. That's what gets them excited, and then they understand it because that's what really happens in the real world. It's just like you guys are great readers at this point, but you'll get to a word, you'll read a kid in a dinosaur book, you'll get to a word you've never read before, or an Old Testament part, you've never read that name before. Of course, no one can argue with you because no one knows how to pronounce it anyway, right? But you can read it, that's the point. You can read it, at least have a stab at it. So teaching spelling actually is a very important part of the reading process. And then once we get to that point, we want them to use those newly acquired skills to read sentences. So once they've decoded a lot of words, then we start putting words in sentences so they can read them and move further with that. Initially when we teach sentences, it's just 3-word sentences. The frog jumps, something like that. No capitalization, no punctuation. Then we introduce capitalization. Well, at the beginning of a sentence, we have this big letter we put there. It's a capital letter. And they come to understand that. And when you write your name, use a capital letter. And then when you want people to know that's the end of a sentence, you put a period there. If it's really exciting, you put an exclamation point. If it's a question, you put a question mark. If you're not really, you're thinking, you're comma, then you have another thought. We teach them that stuff too. So punctuation is taught. And then, of course, we want to focus on comprehension. So really, when they start reading these simple sentences, we ask them, what does that mean? Well, the nice thing about it is because they're reading it out loud, they still have auditory memory, and they can tell you what it's about. And that's one of the things that, when people say that we shouldn't do any type of help for kids with dyslexia because they're never going to learn how to read, combinations for them. Then you look at their listening comprehension, which is really great, and the reading comprehension is really poor. And they're like, you're hurting the students to learn the information. How do we get them to the point where they can learn that information? So those 504 plans are really important where we give them audio readers or other techniques or allow them to take longer to take a test, those kinds of things. We're essentially leveling the playing field so they can tell you what they know. Because isn't that what we're really interested in knowing is what they know? Not how you get them to do that. And so listening comprehension, most kids with dyslexia have pretty decent listening comprehension skills. So having an audio reader, they're learning the information, they're learning it, memorizing it, and they can give it to you. But if you make them read it, then it's essentially shuts the gate on. So we want to emphasize the code. It's extremely important. We look at the letter-sound correspondence, the order of teaching letter-sound correspondence. There's a particular order that I think is important. We look at high-frequency letters, like on the Wheel of Fortune. At the very end, they give you the letters, and then you get to add some. Those are high-frequency letters, which means there are a lot of different words. You can make so we want to use those high-frequency letters to make high-frequency words that these individuals will know. Emphasize phonological processing skills, synthesis, which is blending, analysis, which is decoding and segmenting, no letter names to the end of the curriculum. And it reduces confusion. Because we're talking about young children who are given a lot of information. Because we kind of view reading as a pretty simple process because we've been doing it so long. Anything you're good at, you're going to think simple. Like if you know Mandarin or French or German, it's easy to you because you know it. Not easy for me because I don't. So we have to remember what it's like for these little kids. I mean, they got powerful brains, but this is really new and strange information for them. And so the reciprocal nature of the code that we really need for them to know it involves decoding and all these different things, and spelling involves encoding. That's important. So to completely understand the code, one needs really to be able to read and decode and write and encode, to understand the code fully. And we talked about this in earlier sessions. That we can see individuals who, because of an intervention, they had dyslexia, they had an intervention, they look like they're doing fairly well on phonological processing skills and word fluency, and those things look pretty decent. We're like, well, then they don't have dyslexia, but then we look at their spelling and their writing, and it's like, wow, there's still stuff going on. Because oftentimes there is. Phonics is the relationship between the sound of a language and the letters used to represent it. So when you talk about phonics, phonics is a critically important part of learning how to read. Anyone who says otherwise really doesn't know what they're talking about with regard to reading. Looking at words and guessing at them is not the way to teach. Even though ours is an opaque writing system, there is some probability in terms of letters and what they represent. So an L sound is never going to represent a P sound. The vowel sounds are tricky, particularly with all the alternative spellings. But there is a predictable relationship with most of them, at least to some extent. Now, obviously there are examples like if you put E together, we'd say, well, that's E, but sometimes it's like bed, right? So there are those alternative spellings, but we'll first have to teach you about probability. What's the most probable pronunciation? Then let's go next. So how does that work? And so that's important. Linguistic phonics, the way we teach phonics, is we teach reading by introducing the letter sounds for each series of letters. We use letter names to introduce after the letter sounds are mastered. Decoding skills are taught after 3 sound correspondents have been learned. So we want to get them decoding pretty early. We want to get them synthesizing almost immediately after we teach them how to decode, because those are 2 processes that work together. Like, it's great if you can decode, but decoding in itself isn't going to help you read a word. You have to decode and synthesize, decode and blend, right? So we want them to be taught together. So these things are all kind of taught in combination. Don't do it, one at a time, because that's not how it works in the real world. It's not how it works when you guys come across a new word you haven't seen before. You decode and synthesize. You teach letter writing, you teach spelling. So what I've been describing to you is a curriculum that we wrote a number of years ago. It's called The Secret Codes, and it's for kindergarten children. And essentially, I'm just going to do a brief summary of it, just as an example. I don't know of any other programs that are very much like what this is like, but it's one that's been used for about 10 years, and the school system that used it, that has been using it, they dropped their kids who have reading issues from 20% to 3%, which is, so I'm telling you when I say that I disagree with the notion that kids will have reading failure if they have dyslexia with effective classroom instruction. There's very few classrooms that actually have appropriate instruction for dyslexia. And the nice benefit is that if it's appropriate for kids with dyslexia, it's appropriate for all kids. I mean, there are some kids you can throw a book at, and they'll pick it up, and for some reason, I don't understand these kids, but I've seen a few of them, like they're 3 years old, they pick a book up and they can start reading. You're like, what? How'd that work? There's a lot of things I don't understand. How someone can listen to a song on the radio and go play it on the piano. I wish I could do that too, but I can't. So humans do some pretty amazing skills, but for most people, we can't do those things. So to think we can just throw a book at a kid and they just pick it up and read it, it's not going to happen. But if we teach them the mechanics of how our particular writing system works and how to read it, it'll help not only kids who have dyslexia, but all kids, even good kids who will be good readers. So in day one, this is after the first week or two, because when kids come into kindergarten, they got to learn the rules of school. They just can't run out of the classroom and run home. Where the bathroom is, they have to raise their hand, that kind of stuff. So after that, the first day of the instruction, it's an introduction to the concept of a code. So we show them Walmart signs, McDonald's sign, a stop sign, bathroom signs. They'll walk about in the school and say, see, these are all signs. These are signs that tell us important things. Play red light, green light, which is a sign. And then we discuss the nature of the secret code, which is, we're going to learn a secret code. It's not really a secret, but you don't know it yet, so it's kind of like a secret. And kids get excited about hearing the word secret, so one of the reasons why we say it. We tell them that they're going to be a little detective and they have to figure this stuff out like little detectives, which gets them even more excited. The next day they come in, day 2, we review the concept of a code. Then we show them the letter A, the lowercase a. We tell them it's A. We don't ask them the letter name, we don't care about that. Remember, we're going to wait till the very end of the curriculum to deal with that. So we tell them it's an A sound. We show them the letter A. They say A. We show them words with A in it. Not only just the initial position, but medial position as well. Then they write the letter A as they're saying A. Because again, we're trying to get that into long-term storage. So they see all these different things, they hear the sound of the word, etc., and they practice writing A, and they have some homework. And they go home, and only for 10 minutes they say A when they see the letter A. They do some small group activity where they practice writing again and doing some other things. We'll get a little more time on task. Because this will take about 5 minutes, the initial day is 5 minutes. The next day they review letter A, then it's A, and we show them the letter N, lowercase and uppercase. Tell them it's etc. Do the same thing, show some words, and they write them. They do small group activity where they're writing some more. On small group activity, on this day though, they not only do write the N and say they write the A and say ah. Then they have some homework. Homework is optional. Some places won't do the homework. The next day we do T, which they review A and N and then N. Show them the letter T, lowercase and uppercase, show them that represents T. Show them some words in it, etc. So you can see this same kind of predictable things happening every day, but it gets more involved because there's more letters. Every time they learn something new, they have to practice it from that day forward. Day 5 of actually doing any work in kindergarten, we're going to read the word ant. So they come in, they review the letters A, N, and T, and then we show them the word ant and say, what does this letter stand for? I don't like saying stand for because of preposition at the end. With little kids, we're like, okay with that. Because I thought about saying, well, we can say represent means it stands for, but that's too confusing. We'll just say stand for. So we say, we have ant up here. We say, what does it stand for? And they go, ah. What about this one? What about this one? Let's put together. And the kids are doing it with us, and they go, ant. I'm like, oh my gosh, they're reading. 5 days in their kindergarten, they're reading. Not only that, but they're learning the utility of why they're learning the letter sounds, right? So that, then they work on that. And if you can decode the word ant and say it, you can decode the word at and an and tat, which I used to say in the beginning. We don't talk about tat because nobody knows the tatting, how you do tatting, right? But then somebody told me, but they do know tats. I was like, oh my gosh, you're right. So now we talk about tats, tact. They don't know the S sound, so we talk about tact. And so then they're working on ant, and they do small group activity where they're writing A and saying and all that kind of stuff. They do homework. And then spelling is a couple of days later, they do S and D. Then they learn how to spell ant, which they don't know the letter names yet. So what we do is say, get the letter card out, because each day they get a new letter card to put in a letter ring. Say, if we're going to spell ant, what does ant begin with? Ah. And they look around, they get their A and they put it there, and then and then they're spelling. But they're not writing it, and they're not saying the letter names. And then they keep going. They work on those various things. That got out of order, but So we're working on essentially the decoding and the encoding part of it at the same time when we get to spelling. We want to get that married together pretty quickly so they understand that it's very important to be able to spell in addition to being able to write. And in 28 day, they have their first sentence. So as I said earlier, once they've read a few words, then we put them in sentences. So I won't really discuss that. Days, activity 77, they do their first paragraph. And by the time they get to their first paragraph, they know capitalization and punctuation. And by the end of the curriculum, the kids are actually, they know their letter names, and we teach them in the way that makes sense to them. Because by this time, for the letter A, for example, they know it represents A and A. So you hold up the letter card and say, what are the sounds that go with this letter? And they go, someone will say A, someone will say A, will say, who said A? You know what's really interesting? Because the actual name of this letter is one of its sounds, A. So A, E, I, O, and U are all that way. Then for the consonants, we do the consonants where there's the consonant and an E sound is the name, like B, C, D, G, P, T, V. And then we do the ones where there's a short E sound before the sound, F, L, M, N, stuff that makes sense to them. We try to make it so, these things make some sense to them. J and K, they have a long A after them. And then we got the weird ones. H, Q, R, W, and Z. Z should be up there with the E sound. Oh, it is. I don't know why I got it twice. I guess because it's last, it's got to be last. That shouldn't be there. And then by that point, they're pretty much off and running in terms of what's going on with the reading process. So each new activity involves introducing a new letter sound. So the kindergarten curriculum is based around the phoneme. And they do each of these things while they're practicing, and it really instills them pretty well. The detective notebook, they actually write stuff in their notebook. But initially, I was a little worried that the kids wouldn't get the gist of this. And as I told the story earlier in a different session, the principal is taking 2 school board members on a tour of the school, and they happen to come upon the kindergarten classroom that was, initially it was just one classroom, now they're all using it. But they came into the classroom and the kids were coloring alligators. And so the principal said, class, what does alligator begin with? As thinking they would all say what? Hey! But they all went, ah! And the principal's like, what? I have to fire this teacher. This is really goofiness, right? And so one of the little kids, obviously one of the brighter kids in the classroom, jumped out of his chair and said, hey, we're little detectives. We're learning the secret codes. And to learn the secret codes, you have to, and he explained it all to him. I'm like, wow. I guess kindergartners can figure this out. But like I said, it went from 20% of the kids had issues, it would drop down to 3%. So almost the entire class got it, if you give them the appropriate stuff. And we're not cramming this down like we're always trying to, like someday you think, well, we're going to do calculus in kindergarten, seriously, we're going to do that? But this is developmentally appropriate for them. They understand this concept. And if we give it to them in little pieces, where they understand the gist of it, then we can start sneaking in the weird stuff later, and they're like, okay, this is a weird one, this is how I get it. And the first grade curriculum is based on the morpheme, not the phoneme. The morpheme is the smallest unit of meaning. So we talk about root words, alternative spellings, and pre and post stuff. So remediation procedures, these are procedures for kids who obviously haven't had the secret codes. They're out there and struggling with dyslexia, and we don't know what to do with them. The first thing I want you to know is remediation does change brain processing. So if you look at, these are kids without dyslexia, and you can see that the blue and the green circles at the posterior part of the brain, those are the parietal temporal, the upper part, and the occipital temporals, the lower part. Now those are associated with word form and letter sound correspondence. And you can see with kids without dyslexia, the red, which is Broca's area, which we used to think was just involved with speech production, we now know is more involved with language, including reading. You can see that it's not activated much. This is how much of the brain is activated. Now you see kids with dyslexia, and you can see the blue and green are completely gone, right? There's nothing really going on there, which indicates they're struggling with the letter sound correspondence and with word form. They just don't get that. And we know, genetically speaking, that prenatally those pathways weren't laid down, so they don't have them to be used. But what you can see is they're over-activating Broca's area. So they're going, I'm really trying to read this stuff, and they're trying to send all of that information up an area that's not able to process it very well. So if anybody ever tells you that kids with dyslexia are lazy, that's the problem. This is evidence that's absolutely not true. They're doing everything in their power to learn how to read. It's just not working for them. So also we can see what happens as a function of remediation effects. This one is a child that does not have dyslexia. It's from a different study. Here's a kid with dyslexia. You can see really not much, nothing's going on in the blue and a teeny bit's going on in the red, right? Over a larger area, but not as concentrated. But after they've been involved with an intervention, look what happens. In the blue, it starts getting lit up. It's activated. In other words, if you give them the appropriate intervention, it's going to actually change brain processing. And I know there's all kinds of people come into your school district and say, we do brain balance, we do all these things, and kids do this, and across the midline. It's all bogus. There's a lot of bogus information out there. But anytime you learn something new, like if you learn anything today that you didn't know before, you've changed your neurochemistry. Because that's what memory is neurochemistry changes. And maybe even neural pathway changes if you do it long enough. But here what we're trying to do is activate parts of the brains that have not been activated before because they weren't being utilized because those neural pathways weren't there yet. That's science. We can show you this stuff. There's other people that come in here and tell you about, if they use the word brain, first thing you gotta know is, do they really know what they're talking about? When they talk about stuff you think, I don't know, that doesn't sound right, it's probably not right. There's a lot of stuff with the brain that people talk about that's not true, like you've heard right-brainers and left-brainers and all that baloney. There's really no scientific evidence for that either. I mean, we do lateralize certain functions in the left and right hemispheres, but in terms of a person being primarily a right-brainer versus left-brainer, there's just no evidence for that. It's way beyond the science. It's not even, I guess you could say it's science fiction. Because it's just, it's not like we haven't discovered it yet. People have looked. Spear and Gazzaniga, the two pioneers that looked in this area, they never saw anything like that. The only way you could get actually a right brain or left brain is to split the corpus callosum, which is the major superhighway of axons between the two hemispheres. The other thing you hear about fairly often is that we only use 10% of our brain. Totally not true. Absolutely, unequivocally, totally not true. The only thing that even comes close to being truth there is that the brain doesn't all get lit up all at one time. It's a serial processor. In other words, as we're processing information, it goes from here to here to here to here to here very rapidly, but they're not all lit up at the same time. That's true. But the rest of it, most people talk about brain stuff and they don't really know what they're talking about. So you always have to be wary. One of the things you should do is wear little buttons that says, question authority. People, and even me, I don't say anything that I don't find that I can find a basis in the scientific literature, because I'm just not that kind of person. If you asked me when I was 4 years old what I want to do, and I'd go, I want to be a scientist, because I was born in the show me state. Show me the data. If I don't see the data, and I'm a real pain in the butt about that, because my wife says, hey, this interesting study, I'm like, yeah, but here's some alternative hypotheses that are all, if they didn't control for this, and she's like, oh, why do I even talk to you? And you know those commercials on television where people say, a double-blind study done by, and I call them up and say, what's the double-blind study? Can you give me the reference for this study? Like, they're making stuff up. If there's no reference in science for it, it doesn't exist as far as I'm concerned. Now, sometimes it may, and they just don't know it, but there's too many people out there talking about brain stuff that they don't know what they're talking about. Absolutely, unequivocally do not know what they're talking about. So we're talking about intervention strategies. One of the things we're going to look for is a multi-sensory structured language program, which there are a lot of them today. There are a lot of them out there. Multi-sensory structured language program. Structure of language, we're doing, like we do with the secret codes, that's structured language. We're also talking about multi-sensory. So that falls within the ballpark. But these programs have to have phonological awareness, there's no doubt about it. They have to have sound symbol association, because that's what the reading process really is, learning the sound symbol association. It needs to be instruction on syllables. Really, linguists don't talk about syllables, they talk about morphological units, but for us, the layperson, we call them syllables, syllable types, like a closed syllable, if a consonant follows a vowel sound, generally speaking, it's going to be a short vowel. Those are clues that you can tell kids that'll help them with pronunciation. It's not always true, so you can't say it's a rule. Because there are times that there's a long vowel that comes before a consonant, so I mean, you can't always say that. Or you can say an open syllable. Most of the time, if you have an open syllable, which means that the vowel sound is not followed by a consonant, most of the time it's going to be a long sound, right? Not always. But it's a good clue. And if we tell them the little detectives and they have to test hypotheses, then they're not going to go, oh, that didn't work, that didn't make sense. They're going to go to the next hypothesis, because that's what we want them to do. We'll talk about morphology, that's important, and syntax, and then semantics. The meanings of what's happening, not just how we put it together. Orton Gillingham, you hear about OG a lot probably. Orton Gillingham comes from Orton, Samuel Orton. And Samuel Orton was brilliant, absolutely brilliant. He was a neuropsychiatrist and a pathologist, and he got really interested with dyslexia. And he studied with Alzheimer, which you've heard of him, right? We're all worried about that. But in 1925, he wrote Word Blindness. And in it, a lot of the things we know about dyslexia to be true today, he already had a notion of in 1925. So I'm telling you, this guy is brilliant. And Anna Gillingham was a psychologist we partnered with, where he came up with the concepts, she wrote the curriculum. So Orton Gillingham is based on neurological processing as they knew it then. In 1925, I mean, in 1925, you could go to a shoe store, and if you want to see how your shoe fit, you could get an x-ray of your foot, which is really stupid, right? In the store. Look at that. I got cancer, I don't know why. So there's a lot of stuff we didn't know. They didn't have fMRI, they didn't have any of that kind of stuff. It just, so it's amazing the stuff they figured out. This guy's brilliant. And so is Anna Gillingham in creating a curriculum that could actually help kids become better readers based on what they found with kids that have dyslexia. So she developed those training manuals. So when you see Orton Gillingham, it's got a long tradition, science and neurologically based information that help kids become better readers. And they've morphed and changed over the course of, almost 90 years, right? So, actually 91 years. So Orton he became convinced that dyslexia was not a perceptual problem. Still, people talk about perceptual problems, putting colored overlays on stuff, that there's some type of visual processing difficulty. There is not. There is not. When you look at visual training, tracking, and stuff like that, look at some of the stuff on the internet for pediatric ophthalmologists and strabismus, they'll tell you that stuff does not work. As psychologists, we've known for an even longer period of time that did not work. It still doesn't get people. Parents will do anything to help their kids become good readers. So if they want to do the scotopic sensitivity stuff where they put color overlay on tops of words and they think, oh my gosh, it helped my kid, probably doesn't. But there's a lot of stuff out there that's bogus. So you have to really, in my opinion, all teachers need to be trained in science. They need to be trained in behavior modification techniques. Then you talk about classroom discipline, and then you can look at this stuff and go, I don't think the science is there on that, and then you won't believe it. And I think, unfortunately, too many times we fall into some of those fads that just, there's no substance to them. But he became convinced that dyslexia was not a perceptual problem, it was not a visual problem, it was a language problem. And so he started looking at this, and he called it specific reading disability. In 1925, he called it specific reading disability. And he talked about strengths and weaknesses, which we're talking about that now. School psychologists are out there now. The big thing is strengths and weaknesses, right? So, I mean, this is not new stuff. I mean, 1925, it's pretty amazing. He also said that it was not with the problems with the children per se, but they were all teachable given appropriate instruction. So here's what Gillingham came in and said, okay, let's figure out this appropriate instruction. What is the appropriate instruction for kids that have dyslexia? And so the OG approach is personalized, it's language-based, multisensory, And unfortunately, there's not a lot of research that's pitted OG against other stuff. They haven't really done that. So I think it's because basically it came out of a medical notion. In a medical notion, if it's working, why do we need to really see, something else? It's like my son was involved with a horrendous accident here in Tulsa. He's a runner. He got hit by, on January 2nd, he got hit, he broke his hip, his femur, skull fracture, and a serious TBI, very serious. Almost lost him twice. And what they did for him in the neurotrauma ICU, which he was in a coma for 3.5 weeks, and he's there for 4 weeks. And this just happened on January 2nd, so we're just getting to the point where he's recovering. But they have a particular protocol they use. They cool the body down, and then they do this. They use pentobarbital to chill his brain out. They do all that. And right now, he's almost 100% back. It's like a miracle. It's science, but it's miraculous. But do you really want your kid to be in a study like, oh, well, this is what we do, we could do this other thing? No, man, do what works, right? And see, in that medical model, they don't do, like, psychologists are like, we got to pit everything to see which ones work better, the science part of it. But when you're actually involved with helping people who are in treatment, we don't do that. So, I mean, OG came out of that medical, neurological notion, so there really hasn't been that research to pit it against other approaches. But we know that this approach works. And so that's, I don't think a huge problem, but I think you're going to see some research looking at this in the future, which works better. But if you look at all the OG programs, they all seem to be pretty effective in one way or another. So they're systematic and structured, sequential, incremental, and cumulative. They get more involved as they go. Diagnostic, and then you go the next step based on whatever the diagnostic criteria are telling you. Systematic phonics are used. There's direct instruction, which, by the way, direct instruction is the way all instruction should be. That's one of the huge studies that they've done in the United States that look direct instruction versus, child-centered instruction stuff. Direct instruction always had the best outcome. But, we don't talk about that as much as we should. Applied linguistics, feedback and positive reinforcement. It's cognitive and it's emotionally sound. They're trying to make it nice for the kids too. And so there's a lot of approaches. Here are all the approaches that you probably heard of some of these. Wilson language training, alphabetic phonics, the association method, Lindemann Bell was pretty popular. The Herman approach, Montessori, Slingerland, Barton is one that I think people in Tulsa probably are familiar with. They're all OG methods. In fact, Barton, what she did was, a lot of these approaches say you have to come for a long training that's very expensive. And Martin said, hey, let's translate this and put it on the web and parents can just buy it for me and do it with the videos and stuff. And I think she's right. I think the intervention is something that everyone can learn how to do. The interventions that we use, people can definitely use. So our methods are a little bit different in that we start off, my initial work in dyslexia was looking at the differences in performances of good and poor readers in their ability to discriminate speech sounds. And we found that poor readers were very poor at discriminating with speech sounds, where good readers were much better. And by the way, if I'm going past time, you should know, because there's a lot more material in this section, but there's a lot more to cover. So if you need to escape, just let me know. But we do the phonemic discrimination task, which essentially prepares the brain for dealing with other tasks that come after that. And so they listen to sounds and tell us if they're the same or different based on what they're hearing. And we move to letter knowledge and work with phoneme synthesis, which is developmentally easier than decoding. And what we do is we give them two speech sounds a second apart, like b, a, and they put them together. Bay, s, e, and they put them together. So that's phonemic synthesis, but it's developmentally a little simpler. Yes?
This doesn't match your presentation.
I know.
Can you email it? Can you send us?
Yes, what I'm going to do is I'm going to send it to them to put on their site.
Okay.
Because I sent the wrong one to the printer and people were stapling for me and I didn't realize. Phonemic test. And let me see if there's anything you really need to know. This stuff you can kind of check on your own. But these kind of go through each of the tasks separately, so you can see how that works. And I'll have that sent so you can see that. But this particular process works pretty well, because we've got, we see kids improving roughly within 2 to 3 months. We see lots of improvement. Some kids take longer based on their deficiencies that are present. But generally speaking, we see some pretty good progress within 2 to 3 months. And I think part of the reason that ours sees such quick response is that discrimination task, which kind of, you know, if your kids ever played this game with you where they say, hey, mom or dad, say hop 10 times really quick, and you go hop, 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 hop. They say, what do you do at a green light? And you go, stop. Oops. No, you don't do that at a green light. You go at a green light, right? But see, the phonology of it got you ready to say stop, right? And so what the discrimination task is, it's getting the brain ready to listen to speech sounds in a different way. So we ask them to start manipulating speech sounds, they're more able to do that. And so we see more rapid progress than I think a lot of these other methods, but I think maybe that's why. And of course the last thing, it absolutely must be fun. If it's not fun, kids won't come back. So the people that we have who are interventionists at our center, I handpick them. They have to like kids, they have to be fun, they have to be willing to learn the science and the technology involved with it. But if it's not fun, you know, kids, and we have kids that we got kids that come down from Kansas City, which is a 2-hour drive, and they're like, when do I get to go back? Because it is fun for them. And you can see this is some, we're not very traditional, you know, got bean bags and other stuff.
So this is going to be on the program.
He had a severe case of ADHD. It was just really a rough case, but he had above average intelligence. And so where I told the mother, I said, look, it's probably a year before we see any improvement. In 2 days, we saw improvement.
So, kids with severe articulation or language delays, or in that process of producing those sounds, if they're not hearing them appropriately, it may take a lot longer.
It may. But generally speaking, like, we don't discriminate on the basis of, as long as they have a reading problem, we see them. We've seen, you know, we've seen individuals who were intellectually disabled, which is the new terminology. So we don't discriminate, and we've seen progress in each case. But it's science.
I mean, that's exciting.
Yeah, it is for us, because we'll invite kids down for a week of intervention, which is from 9 to 4:30. It's really hardcore intervention. And each week I'm thinking, oh gosh, I hope this works, I hope this works, and it does. I'm like, you know. The week long is a highly intensive intervention, but mostly kids, you know, those are for kids who don't live by us. The kids who do live by us, they come 2 or 3 times a week for maybe a year, maybe a few months. It just depends on what's going on.
Do you have kids where, like, I have some kids where the letters, the print on the page moves, so it vibrates, or it's even had one kid read like this, and why are you doing that? So I thought people were falling off the page.
Yeah, there's she said some of the kids that it looks like the words are vibrating on the page. What's interesting, there's a MIT astrophysicist who has dyslexia, and he would normally get up in the morning and his wife would read him the paper because he had a very severe case of dyslexia. But she was sick that day, and he went out to get the paper and it got rained on, it was messed up, so he got on his iPhone and started looking up the articles that he wanted to read it from the paper, and he realized he could read them. He's like, how can this be? Well, it's because they only showed so many words per line. And he realized if you manipulated that, it made it easier for kids to focus on the reading process who have dyslexia. Now that's not the problem with dyslexia, but that can be a secondary consequence if they're trying to pay attention and, you know, it's just not working
If you
for
slow
them.
down their movement and it's bigger print as well.
Yep.
So I guess I'm actually working with bigger print.
Bigger print and highlighting, you know, maybe word by word or whatever. But it's not a visual process, but you can get, just like you guys in college, you read lots, you know, and you get to a point sometimes it looks like the words are just falling off the page. You're exhausted. But these kids get exhausted because you're asking them to work with processing skill, they don't do very well. It's a major problem. Yes?